Stories from Real Life is an independent podcast that is written and produced by Melvin E. Edwards. You can get details about each episode or contribute to the future success of this show by visiting the website at www.podcastreallife.com.
On today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, our guest is retired federal judge Mary Beth O'Connor. For Judge O'Connor, childhood abuse and other traumas led to substance use disorder. She struggled with a meth addiction from 16 to 32 years old. By incorporating ideas from multiple sources to build a secular recovery plan that works for her, Mary Beth has accrued 30 years of sobriety. She chronicled her journey in her award-winning book, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. Let's join today's guest, Mary Beth O'Connor, and your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to this episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me on this week's storytelling journey. This is my first recording in my new podcast studio that's not quite finished yet. So for those of you who are listening on the audio version, please go to YouTube and check out the progress and let me know what you think the color of the back wall should be. We'll consider that along the way. So as you heard in the intro, our guest this week is former federal judge Mary Beth O'Connor. Hello, Judge, and thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, thanks for having me. And please, Mary Beth is fine.
Okay, Mary Beth. So, Mary Beth, everyone loves a rags to riches type of story and a happy ending, but no one really wants to see the messy middle part that's included in those stories. So, unfortunately, your messy part started just 1 week after you were born. So, can you share your life's journey, how your life's journey began, and tell us how you're doing right now?
Yeah, and it actually really started on my conception because it was like 1960. My mother is not married to my biological father. She's an Irish Catholic. This was a major ordeal for the family, and he refused to marry her. And so when I was born, my grandparents wouldn't let her bring me home, and I was left at a convent for the first 6 months of my life until she married what became my adoptive father and my sister's biological father. So that little explanation is so complicated already, and I'm barely out of the womb. But that is how it started. It was sort of trouble from the beginning. That's absolutely right.
Well, how are you doing today?
Well, I mean, today, is many, many years later. And so, as you say, it's about that progression upward. But today I'm doing great, but that's after many years of dealing with different forms of abuse, neglect, and a long-term methamphetamine addiction. I shot meth for many years, but I'm now almost 31 years sober. And in my sobriety, I had to not only deal with my substance use, but also my trauma. I had PTSD, I had severe anxiety, sort of a combination that's more common than I think people appreciate. And so to get to the sort of the productive and happy place I am today really required tackling all of that, not just getting sober.
So do you think you were a different type of a judge than you would have been under different circumstances?
I think to a degree. I mean, I was a federal administrative law judge, so I didn't get to make the law. I really had to follow the law. So there were certain constraints and I didn't always agree with it, but, I was obligated to do so. But certainly when I interacted with people, I didn't do criminal cases, but I did a lot of disability cases. So I saw a lot of people with similar histories to me, people that had physical and or sexual child abuse, which I did, people that turned to substances early for relief, right? Emotional relief, help with dealing with their pain, and who sort of got stuck for a long time. A lot of them had untreated mental health. So I definitely understood where a lot of them were coming from. I had empathy and sympathy, which hopefully other judges too. But, when you really understand the experience, it can be a little different. And there were rules I had to apply about substance use, which I wasn't happy with, but I applied them. That's what I was obligated to do. But to get the information, it wasn't like I didn't do it in a judgmental way. I was polite and I got the information I needed to get in order to apply the law that I was required to apply.
And your book is called From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. You retired as a judge in 2020. Is that when you decided to write your book?
So I started thinking about it when I was a new judge. So for me, it's sort of the short version of the story is after, the nunnery and all that, I lived with a mother who was not really bonded to me. She wasn't interested and she could be violent. But when I was 9, she married my stepfather. She had divorced her first husband, and he was very violent with her. He was physically and sexually violent with me. And all that is sort of a common pathway to early extreme drug use. And so I started using alcohol at 12. I was, did weed, pills, a lot of hallucinogens. And then I was doing meth at 16, and I started shooting meth within 6 months at 17. So it was a vast escalation, and I didn't get sober till 32. And so when I became a judge, it was really a reflection time. Like, how on earth did I go from shooting meth at 17 until basically 32 and yet become a federal judge? And then I started thinking about, could that story be abuse? Is that story unusual enough that I could use it for a positive purpose? And so I thought about that, and I started reading memoir to see sort of what was out there, because I didn't want to write a book that was already out there, 22 times. But what I realized was a lot of memoirs, they don't really go into why the substances were attractive. And so in the first third of my book, I talk about what led up to that sort of extreme level of substance use. And then at the end, it's sort of like, well, I went to a couple meetings and everything was great. And that's not how recovery works. And so 30% of my book is about my first 3 years of recovery, both the substance recovery and the trauma and mental health recovery. So it goes into more detail about how I built a foundation that worked for me, what I was thinking, the different factors and considerations. And also, I used a few 12-step techniques, which is like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and all those. But that's not the foundation of my recovery. I built a more individualized recovery plan. And so I wanted an example of that out there. So it was sort of all those reasons where I thought I could write a book that was different than what I saw, but also that would be useful, provide useful example, useful information, and then to try to reduce stigma, right? By saying, look, you can actually be in that miserable, horrible place of shooting meth for many years that I was in. But if we help people get sober, their future can be, bright. They can live a happy and productive life. And so it was sort of all of that was playing into why I decided to spend the time writing the book.
You were 6 years into your recovery when you enrolled at Berkeley Law School.
Yes.
Were there ever any challenges to your recovery during those like law exams and really difficult courses that might have created stress?
So for me, and for most of us, the sort of the time you have to hyper focus on your recovery is generally the first, say, 18 to 36 months. Like, it's the beginning. Because in the beginning, your brain is sort of telling you, you need those drugs. Like, you can't give them up, right? But also, part of why early recovery can be a challenge is because you've been using the drugs to sort of tamp down your emotions and your pain. And now that you don't have the drugs, the pain starts coming to the surface and you don't really know how to handle it. And so it takes practice and healing and dealing with different situations, like you're out and suddenly somebody offers you a drink that you weren't expecting. With practice, those things get easier. And with healing, the compulsion to use gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And so by the time I went to law school at 6 years sober, I wasn't really struggling with the substance cravings or, impulse, but I still was very much in the midst of resolving my PTSD and my severe anxiety. And that did show up in law school because law school is very stressful. And, there's a lot of pressure to do well. And I went to law school 16 years after I graduated college. So it was, a risk in trying to study again and take an exam again. And so my anxiety was better by that point, but it was still challenging. And that definitely created a lot of sort of spinning and fears and obsessive thinking during law school.
All right. How did your addiction affect your career even after law school?
Yeah. So, I'll go back a step back. So basically, I did graduate from Berkeley College undergrad in sort of the normal time frame. But I spent the next 10 years after college graduation not working my way up that corporate ladder like my, peers, but working my way down, okay? Because I couldn't hold a job because I was using meth all the time. And so when I got sober, I was 32 with a Berkeley degree and good grades and then like embarrassing resume. And so for me, I really had to sort of be realistic about what I was ready for. So on one hand, nobody was hiring me for a career job. Like that wasn't going to happen. But also I wasn't ready. And so I really started small. I didn't like it. Because when you get sober, there's sort of this urge to sort of make up for lost time. I want to like leap ahead fast, but I was realistic and I, gritted my teeth and admitted reality. And I started at a low-level administrative temporary job was my first job out of rehab. And then I went to a mid-level permanent job. And then I got a supervisory job at a larger company and a promotion. And then at 6.5 years sober, law school. So all of that was a period of time where I was really starting to get, discipline, being able to handle multiple projects at work, meet deadlines, all of those sort of positive habits. And then when I graduated law school, I had to get, you had to get licensed by the bar. I'm in California, so it's the California bar. So the California bar doesn't say, for example, have you ever done any illegal drug? That's not what they ask. What they say is, in the last 5 years, have you ever used an illicit substance, or do you feel that have you had a problem with a substance, including alcohol? And so by the time they asked me about 5 years, I was 9.5 years sober. And then when I got a job as a federal class action lawyer, I think they asked about 7 years, and I was 15 years sober. And when I was a judge, they asked about 10 years, but I was 20 years sober. So I was sort of always ahead on the sobriety path that I could answer honestly and not tell them. But I did, when I was a judge, tell them eventually, because I joined the board for LifeRing Secular Recovery, and that's considered an outside activity. So I had to run it through ethics. But I didn't give them details. I just said, I'm 23 years sober. I'm going to join this board. Here's what I'm going to do, and I got it approved. So that was the first time I was required to disclose to an employer, and that is the first time I disclosed to an employer.
Were you nervous about that?
I was a little, although I had 20 years sober when I was appointed a judge. I mean, the reality is that the odds of me developing a substance problem at that point was basically the same as the odds of anybody developing a substance problem. I wasn't at higher risk really at that point when you look at the data. I mean, it was so long ago, but it is nerve-wracking because you don't know how people are going to respond. Most people, if they hear you have 20 years of sobriety, especially if they think it's alcohol, they will be like, good job, proud of you. But some people won't. But then if they find out it's meth, sometimes that can really change the perspective, as if there's a really big difference between one drug and another as far as addiction goes, when there really isn't. And then if you say you shot a drug, well, that's like a whole nother layer. So I wasn't saying those things, but there is that little nervousness. I knew it would get through the ethics process. There was nothing problematic about joining that board, but it is, you don't know what people's personal experiences with substances. You don't know what their personal opinion is. And once you disclose it, you can't take it back, and then I will say, my next big disclosure was after I had retired. I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where I said I was a former judge and a former meth addict. And so, as I said, once you announce in the Wall Street Journal that you used to do meth, like there's no turning back from that, right? So that was a very nerve-wracking experience.
The whole world can see it at that point.
That's right, and it never goes away. It's on the internet, So yeah, that was a big reveal for me. That was a big reveal, and I thought carefully about, was it time? And I was retired, and that's why we can have this conversation, broadly. I can say anything now. When I retired, it gave me an opportunity to be of service in a new way because I could speak openly without having to worry about professional ramifications. So I try to use that to help my community.
And in part of helping your community, you train attorneys, judges, and medical professionals. How have they responded to knowing your past?
Lawyers have what's called continuing legal ed requirements. So they have to, take a certain number of units. And so I created a substance use continuing legal ed training, which, I've done in a variety of states. But so I give them my personal story. And then I start off really with the basic, like what is the definition of substance use disorder, which is the modern name for addiction. That's the medical term that we use today. I really start there because people don't really understand what the definition is. And I go through like treatment options, and lawyers have double the rate of addiction for every substance, from alcohol to opiates to stimulants. Your attorneys have double the rate. And so part of what I go through is the why of that. But I also use it as a chance to educate them about some of the things that the legal system does wrong around drugs. So for example, drug courts, some of them are really up on the evidence. They understand, what works and what doesn't. And some of them will still have things like severe consequences because someone isn't perfectly abstinent from day one, when most people aren't able to be perfectly abstinent from day one. I wasn't perfectly abstinent from day one. I used 3 times in my first 5 months. So I try to provide education and information and give them some things to think about. But in general, I think they listen harder because of the personal story. So I try to use sort of my judge title and my personal history as an ear opener. It's sort of a tool at this point.
And speaking of your story, is there a particular type of person who gains the most inspiration from hearing your story and then being able to move forward?
I mean, I talk a lot about a couple factors that I think help. Like, for example, I talk a lot about that I was 32 when I got sober. It wasn't like I used drugs for 5 minutes. I mean, I used drugs for 20 years. And for a lot of people, that's a reassurance for them if there's, if they've been living that misery for a long time, but also for their friends and family. If their friends and family know that I wasn't young when I got sober, that I used for a long time, that can make them feel more optimistic about the future of the person they love who's struggling with substances. And I talk about meth for that reason as well. There are not a lot of people who are public about meth use, or that they shot meth. And so methamphetamine is a significant problem in the U.S. It's starting to pick up steam again, and in certain parts of the country, it never went away. People are still about 20% of the overdose deaths have methamphetamine related. So that helps because it's just not as common to be talked about. But I do my goal is to help not just the person struggling, but also to increase understanding and reassurance for the friends and family who love them.
And has there ever been a time when sharing your story was tougher than at other times?
Well, I will say when you put things like in the Wall Street Journal, and I've had an op-ed like in the LA Times, where I actually talked about the racial disparity in drug enforcement laws, which might be of interest. People can comment, right? And it's not like the comments are focused on the issue. It's not that I expect everybody to agree with me on the issue. If it was an honest, counterpoint to what I was saying, that would be great. But that's not what happens. What happens is a bunch of personal attacks. And, people that don't even want to consider, like, people were very upset that somebody who used to shoot meth could become a judge. Like, they did not like that combination at all. So I knew that would happen. And my friends had warned me, don't engage. And so I didn't. But it was also, it was my first major public disclosure. So there was a lot of emotion around that, that once I reveal this, it's going to be out there. But but it was part of my plan that I really felt like, now I'm retired. I don't, I'm not going to sit around and watch TV. How can I contribute to the discussion? Do I have something to add? Can I move the discussion forward? Can I share information people might not be aware of? Can I be, as I said, of value to my community? So it wasn't casually that I ended up with an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. It was part of my plan to start doing more service work and education and trying to use my story in a positive way in my retirement.
Okay, and you talked about the comments section, which is always the most dangerous place to go.
Yes.
Online or any publication. I used to be a newspaper reporter early in my career, and one of the things I learned, probably the hard way, was once you write something and then people start commenting, at that point it's really not about you.
Yes.
Because then they start going back and forth like you just didn't read it correctly, and then it becomes like a fight amongst the comments, the letters to the editor people, and it's not about you anymore. And it took me a little while to learn that. I was in my 20s, and so I'm thinking, all right, these people hate me. But it was engagement. That's what you want when you write something publicly.
That's true. And I will say, with the Wall Street Journal piece, I submitted that to the general opinion editor, and he gave it to the religion column. So they published my I Beat Addiction Without God opinion piece in the religion column because they wanted engagement. They wanted engagement. Now, I never disrespect faith-based recovery. I mean, a lot of people recover that way, and I'm glad for them, and I support it. It's just not the way for everyone. In fact, a lot of religious and spiritual people don't actually use faith-based recovery. They use more self-empowered recovery, which is what I did. So there's nothing I did that faith-based people can't use, and many of them do use it. And so a self-empowered recovery is more focused on that I'm sort of the decision maker in my recovery, that I get to decide what's going to be in my plan. But I always viewed it as it's also my job to listen, right? I mean, to be looking for ideas and suggestions. Like, I read all of the Alcoholics Anonymous big book. I read all of the Narcotics Anonymous book. There were some ideas that I used. They have this 1 day at a time idea, which I found really helpful in early recovery. I went to 12-step meetings, but I also found Life Rings Secular Recovery, Women for Sobriety. Today I'm on the board for She Recovers. And so my op-ed wasn't saying it's bad to do it, a faith-based way. It was just saying there are other ways, and many people do it other ways. And my goal is always just to let people know of their choices so they find the right fit. Because if they find the place they're most comfortable or that philosophically fits their worldview best, they're going to have a better chance of success. But yeah, they put it in the religion column because they wanted, I had the second most comments of the year. So in that column, yeah.
Well, they considered that a success. I can guarantee it.
That's right.
Well, have you ever felt anything resembling imposter syndrome as you worked your way up the legal ladder?
I definitely did. And part of it for me was also that anxiety. So for me, because of my trauma history, I had physical and sexual abuse in the home. I had multiple sexual assaults outside the home. I had a violent boyfriend in college. And the PTSD for me showed up a lot as severe anxiety. And what I was really, even when I was sort of moving up the chain professionally, but also in my life in general, I always was waiting for, like, if I made one little mistake, and it's all going to explode in my face. Like I didn't have any trust that the world would treat me fairly or that things were going to work out for me. And so for me, the imposter syndrome was in a sense that, they're expecting me to be perfect. They're expecting me to be this. And I'm going to do something that's going to change their mind. And then I'm going to have this like disproportionate penalty. And so even it really was difficult in that even when I was having successes, I wasn't able to sort of emotionally absorb it the way I kind of deserved to absorb it because I was always so afraid. My husband called me the "what about tomorrow" girl, because no matter how well things were going now, I was always worried about something. But that to me, that meant nothing as far as what was going to to happen tomorrow. Everything would be great today, but tomorrow the world could explode, right? That's how I viewed it. And that was my challenge in work. And sometimes that fear could come out in my behavior, especially in the beginning. Sometimes I could be short with people. I could be aggressive because I was being triggered with fear. And so that was really the biggest challenge for me professionally, especially the first few years.
As you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, you're at the beginning of the 31st year of sobriety. Mm-hmm. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Were you always confident you'd be able to maintain your trajectory after you finally got on the right path?
I will say on the sobriety side, when I went into rehab, I did not actually believe I could get sober. My goal was to figure out how to use less so that my life was less chaotic. And I say that to let people know that it is normal to be ambivalent about recovery and sobriety in the beginning. It's normal. People will go back and forth. They will lack confidence. And so it was only over time when one big factor was when I saw other people succeed who had been in as bad a place as I was. That started making me think, well, if they could do it, then maybe I can do it too. And so that was part of it. I think it's important to be examples, public examples, or even in meetings, so that because hope is important to early recovery. It's hard to do the hard work if you don't have some hope that you will be able to succeed at it. But it's normal to go back and forth. It's normal to not be sure in the beginning. And I definitely wasn't.
And so what do you think is the biggest impediment for people who want to stay sober but aren't able to?
A couple things happen. One is that, again, there's that lack of perfect abstinence can be viewed as a failure or not. So for me, I used 3 times in my first 5 months. 3 times in 5 months was a vast improvement over what I had done for the prior, especially the last 10 years, right? But some people would say, you failed, you failed, you failed. And whereas I view it as I didn't have the skill set I needed yet in order to stay sober, that it was part of the process. So sometimes I think we can turn natural parts of growth, and it's like any habit change, right? I mean, try going to the gym 5 days a week. If you're in the beginning, it's hard to do, or any change. And so sometimes we judge ourselves harshly, and that can create a downward spiral. Another problem is that over half of the people that go in that have a substance use disorder, that have an addiction, they also have another mental health disorder at the same time, like I did. They have PTSD, anxiety, depression, they're bipolar, whatever it may be. And you really need to be treated for both from the beginning if you're going to have the best chance of success. And a lot of times people are only treated for the substance side when they should be being treated for both. The other thing is that we act like everybody can get the treatment that they need, and that's just not true. If you don't have insurance or you don't have cash in many parts of the country, you really don't have access to any treatment, or maybe not the best treatment for you. And so that can be a problem. And then there's also that sometimes people aren't given the individualized assessment that they need. So SAMHSA, like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, part of the federal government, emphasizes the individual nature of recovery. So what ideally should happen is that someone is doing an evaluation of you. Do you need inpatient treatment? Not everybody does. Would outpatient treatment be a good fit for you? What about just working with a therapist with addiction expertise? Or, are peer support meetings going to be sufficient? A lot of times you don't get that individual assessment, and so the treatment you're being offered isn't always tailored to what you need. And then sometimes people don't do well in one program, and they'll say to me, "Oh yeah, I've tried everything," or their family will say they've tried everything. They've been to rehab 5 times, but usually what that means is they actually weren't offered everything. They were offered the same thing 5 times, like over and over again. They were offered the same thing that didn't work the first 4 times, and yet that's why you're being offered the 5th time. And so there are some problems in the system that can get in people's way.
You partially addressed this issue, but I'd like for you to go into more detail. Talking about the worlds intersecting between you speaking publicly about substance abuse and recovery, and also about PTSD and anxiety. How do those worlds look when you're speaking? Do you speak to different conferences, for instance? And how do people seek help when they're dealing with multiple issues at once?
Yeah. So when I talk to almost all of my presentations will mention the interplay of substance use disorder and mental health. But sometimes I'll go in more detail. Like if I'm talking to a therapist group, a psychology group, I might go into more detail about the data on that. Whereas if I'm talking to the lawyers, I'll just give them maybe one slide with about 10 pieces of information. So everything that I do is audience specific, right? Who am I? What information is most valuable to this audience? But there's some really important things for people to understand about that, because I think part of the reason that people feel judgmental to people with substance use disorders is they don't understand the source, and so the truth is that by far the large percentage of people that develop an addiction have either trauma and or an untreated mental health condition. It's a vast majority of people. Other people can develop a problem other ways, but that's by far the most common. And so, for example, there's a thing called an adverse childhood experience score, where you take this test of 10 questions from your childhood about physical violence, sexual violence. Did a parent have a mental health condition? Did you live in poverty? It's stressors like that. And if you have a score of 4 or more, your odds of developing an addiction are about 3 times as high as the general population. And my ACE score is 7, and so those kind of things people don't realize. And then people sometimes will say to me, like, what's the number one thing we could do to reduce the rate of substance use disorder, which is America has one of the highest rates in the world, and there are reasons for that. But to me, I always say mental health treatment for kids, because if we would address it when they're young at the root, they would be much less likely to develop the substance problem later. So I try to put that idea out there, but also to make sure that when friends and family, let's say, are looking at treatment facilities for their family member, which, by the way, should only be offered as options, not mandated, but we can talk about that. But I talk to them about that interplay between mental health and substance use to make sure that they know to look for both, to make sure that when they interview the program, which you should do, and they ask questions, they can say, do you also treat, my son also has bipolar disorder. Can you treat that? How do you treat it? Will you treat it with medications? Or is there a therapist? How often will we see a therapist? Will we have individual counseling? What type of treatment will it be? And so just sort of placing those ideas in people's minds can help them do a better analysis as to what they or their family member might need in treatment. And so hopefully it serves those positive goals when I share that kind of information.
A few years ago, I read a book by former Major League Baseball player Josh Hamilton. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. His story was really interesting to me in that he didn't appear to have any childhood traumas, and he took drugs the first time out of boredom. And he said he knew the very first time he tried it, he was addicted to it. So are there like chemical imbalances that sometimes those drugs artificially meet that stimulate that type of a substance use?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. One is that, most people use all substances in moderation, right? For those of us who are attracted to extreme, drug use, there's something going on. So for him, one thought I have is, for example, if somebody has untreated ADHD, stimulants, because ADHD meds are lower dosage versions of amphetamines, right? That's what ADHD meds are. So if you have untreated ADHD, a stimulant can all of a sudden feel like this is what you've been missing your whole life. It's like it's chemically meeting a need that you're not naturally making the chemicals that other people are making. And so those kind of things can happen. For me, when I first had my first drug, which was alcohol, that really captured my focused attention. It wasn't I thought I'd become addicted, but I thought I need more of this because it made me feel so much better. I mean, I felt like my pain was more distant from me, but also I was happier. Like I was having a more sort of openly good time, which I wasn't able to do without the chemicals. And so the truth is, in the beginning, it seems to work as a solution to a problem, right? But alcohol, I went through alcohol. I went through downer, pills that were opiate-like. I've tried heroin. I've tried a lot of other drugs. But for me, when I had meth the first time, that was clearly the right biochemical fit. I mean, once I tried meth, that's what I wanted. Like I would leave, you could put everything on the table and that's where I'm going. So there was something biochemically about meth that fit me better than the other drugs. And that was the one that I heavily pursued.
Okay. I just have a couple questions left. Mm-hmm. So with your story, you mentioned having your op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal. Have any other national, like TV, for instance, news journal programs expressed any interest in your story?
I've been on television a couple of times doing interviews, in particular about things like Dry January. I've been on some radio shows, even at the national level. I've had opinion pieces and other things like the LA Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Recovery Today. I try to get pieces out there. And there is a producer for Lifetime Movies that's actually reading my book. So, you never know, but I'm not holding my breath, But I will say that I am happy with where I ended up in my retirement. My goal was to create a role for myself where I could be of use, where I could be of value. But at the same time, do it part-time and in a way that I could, sort of have a life besides that. And I'm comfortable with that. I mean, I speak at a lot of conferences. I do the lawyer and judges and some mental health provider trainings. I do a variety of interviews. My book is out. I actually get, good feedback on my book because it's useful. I mean, they've even got like guidelines in the back for people to think about. And so I'm happy with the role I've been in. Oh, and then I'm on the board. I'm on the board for Life Ring Secular Recovery. I'm on the board for She Recovers. So I try to sort of use the book and my judge title, my 31 in a week years of sobriety as sort of a package that will get me the opportunities that I think are important to share information, to give reassurance, and also hopefully to reduce stigma.
So if someone wanted to contact you or read more about your story or get resources that you produced to help in their own recovery or family or friend recovery, how can they follow your work online?
Yeah. So, I mean, my book, again, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, is on Amazon and all the usual sites, and bookstores have it or can get it. My website is junkie2judge.com, and my opinion pieces are there if you'd like to read them. Information about me is there, but also people can message me through my website. So if someone has a speaking opportunity or if they have a question that they want to send to me, I answer every message I get there. And then I'm also on X, Twitter. I'm at Mary Beth O _. And I will say, I don't spend my time arguing with people on Twitter. Okay? I don't have that kind of time. But what I use my Twitter feed for is I provide the new studies that come out, articles about substance use and recovery, and then my recovery thoughts. So I try to provide useful information. Again, always for me, useful information through my Twitter feed as well.
Okay, that sounds great. And again, it's junkie2judge.com for anyone who wants to access that information. So our guest today has been Mary Beth O'Connor, author of From Junkie to Judge. Mary Beth, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been an interesting conversation. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it as well.
So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.